Well, good afternoon, everyone in Beirut, and good morning from Washington, where I am, and welcome to this discussion on Can Democracy Survive Populism? My name is Frances Brown, and I am a Vice President for Studies here at Carnegie, Washington, and I am absolutely delighted to be moderating this timely panel along with an absolutely first-rate set of guests who I will introduce in just a minute. As just a bit more context, I think this panel's topic is exceedingly relevant for the moment we find ourselves in, and also for the overall conference's theme on reverberations of multiple crises, what to expect next year in 2023. Around the world, democracy is in decline. Most analysts of democracy assess that we are essentially in at least a 16-year period of overall democratic decline globally. A huge driving factor or feature in that is the rise of populism globally, as well as a broader sense among many citizens that their democratic governments are not delivering, they're not answering their problems. As we see widening inequality and growing distrust in institutions and in the political establishment, we've seen populist leaders winning elections in regions around the globe. At the same time, the news isn't all bad. We have seen some rebukes to populist leaders, and that's a trend that we need to unpack as well. So our conversation today will be examining populist trends around the world, diving into a few key regions. We'll also discuss the rise of authoritarianism and the politics of austerity that can sometimes relate to political instability. So to do so, as mentioned, we have a fantastic panel. I will introduce them in the order that I'll turn to them first. So first we'll have Moisés Naím. Moisés Naím is a distinguished fellow with us at Carnegie. He's a best-selling author, he's a syndicated columnist, and importantly for our purposes today, he is the author of a recent book entitled The Revenge of Power, How Autocrats Are Reinventing Politics for the 21st Century. Welcome, Moisés.
Hi, and delighted to be with all of you.
Thanks. And next we'll hear from Rachel Kleinfeld. Rachel is a senior fellow with us at Carnegie, and she does work on troubled democracies and the problems they face, including polarized populations, violence, corruption, and poor governance. Importantly, for our purposes, her work really bridges the international cases as well as looking at US democracy. So democracy for me and Rachel here at home, and looking at parallels between them. She's also recently published a really monumental report entitled 5 Strategies to Save US Democracy that we'll be talking about a bit today. Next, we'll hear from Hamza Meddeb. Hamza is the only member of our panel who is in Beirut, and we are particularly happy to see you. Good morning, good afternoon, Hamza.
Frances, good afternoon.
Hamza, in addition to being a fellow with the Carnegie Middle East Center, is also an assistant professor at South Mediterranean University in Tunis. So we'll be delighted to be unpacking his perspective on North Africa and the Middle East as well. And then finally, last but definitely not least, we'll hear from Oliver Stuenkel. Oliver is a non-resident with us at Carnegie and is also an associate professor at the School of International Relations in FGV in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He writes extensively on democratic and authoritarian trends in Latin America, and we're delighted to have you as well, Oliver.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
All right, so given the deep expertise here, I'm going to dive right in. And as I do so, I just wanted to note for the audience, both in person in Beirut and then also online, that we will be gladly receiving your questions as our time together goes on. So please start thinking or feel free for those watching online to start submitting online. So Moisés, I would like to start with you with your really global and historic perspective you take. So in your book, Revenge of Power, that you published earlier this year, you talk about the 3 Ps of populism, polarization, and post-truth that characterize global democratic decline. Can you tell us a bit more about these trends, how they relate to one another, and how, in your view, they differ from previous versions of authoritarianism that we've seen?
Of course, there's a lot of familiar trends that we know that we have existed for a long time, and populism is not new. But it has been amplified, empowered, and is now more global in nature than it was in the past. Populism essentially it rests on the pillar of saying divide and conquer, divide the nation and the polity between the noble people that is exploited by an elite, a caste, a cabal that takes advantage of the circumstances to enrich themselves, to remain in power, to control the situation. But now it has been amplified by levels of polarizations that in many ways we had not seen, because polarization is also not new, but it is now global. The globalization of all of the tricks and the strategies and the tactics used by polarizing politicians are now familiar around the world. Even in countries that are very different, we see them taking the same following the same script. And now it is amplified by the third P after populism and polarization. It is post-truth, and it is the new technologies, the new social media. We have seen and the political consequences of these new technologies are creating that the three Ps are there, but amplified and with consequences that we had not seen before.
Thank you, Moisés. A lot to further examine there, but let's start our sort of regional tour du monde here, and first zoom in on the United States, my own country. Rachel Kleinfeld, you have written extensively on the links between populism, political violence, and democratic decline. And as I mentioned, you've recently turned your lens onto the United States in particular. So I wanted to hear a bit from you on, here in the US, what has enabled the rise of populist leaders and what tactics they've used to gain and maintain power.
Absolutely. Thrilled to be here and share this with such fabulous colleagues. So I want to talk about polarization, factionalization, and then folks in the middle who aren't polarized or factionalized. So first, polarization. Moisés just mentioned this. It's gotten to the greatest extent it's been in America in modern history. It was last similar in the Gilded Age. And this is really where you've got two groups that have such a large separation between policies, but also between their affection for one another, such a large dislike for one another, that they really can't get anything done. And the dislike, the affective polarization is stronger than the policy separation. There's actually much more overlap on policy goals than people think there is. Second, and the reason for that is because of factionalization. This is where your party aligns with other aspects of your personality and identity. So it used to be in America, you could be Republican, but you would share a lot of other identity markers with someone who might be Democratic. But now, whether you're rural or urban, whether you're a minority or a person of color or white, whether you're female or male, a whole series of identity markers go together with party fairly closely. And we know countries that are factionalized like that are 12 times more likely to fall into civil war. What it means in America, which is not likely, I think, to fall into civil war, is simply that voters feel they have everything on the line. Any difference between the party means that their entire identity is threatened. And so what happens is what Milan Spolik wrote about in the Journal of Democracy. Voters are willing to lose a little democracy to prevent the other side from winning. It's not that they love their side so much, but if they have to give up a little democracy to help their side get in power to keep the other side out, they will. And then there's the voters in the middle. Most pundits talk a lot about polarization, but there's this big group in the middle that are not ideologically polarized, but what they are is more anti-democratic. About 4 in 10 Americans believe that to fix America, we need a leader willing to break the rules. A lot of those people are swing voters. They vote for either side. They're really looking for someone to blow up the system. You had 13% of Bernie Sanders voters also voting for Trump. And that's because about 70% believe the whole system is rigged. They believed that before 2016. There's this sense that the elite system that we have is leaving a lot of people behind, and there's a very, very thin safety net. And what all that means is that a populist leader can say, I'm a savior, elect me, the rich ones are seen as less likely to be corruptible. We saw this with Berlusconi after the Clean Hands campaign in Italy. We saw it with Bolsonaro after Lavogiato. It's something anti-corruption activists really need to think about, is how they're putting these rich, personalistic, populist leaders into power. And then when they gain power, and I'll stop here, they also often get more support from young people. We saw less in America, but in El Salvador, Brazil, that young people actually gravitated toward these leaders willing to break the rules and get things done. And and they think it's more democratic. And that's a really dangerous sign for the future.
Thanks, Rachel. That is sobering. And we will turn to the future and solutions, potential solutions subsequently. But continuing on the theme of grim news and turning to another region, I wanted to turn to you, Hamza, currently in Beirut. But I wanted to ask you mostly about Tunisia, where you live. And as you well know, Tunisia for about 10 years was really heralded as one of the sole successes of the Arab Spring. Now that democratic transition appears to be stalled. What can you tell us a little more about that progression? What contributed to the rise of populist President Kais Saied last year and his ultimate power grab in July of last year? I think you may be muted. Excuse me, Hamza, we can't hear you online.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect, thank you.
Perfect, okay. No, I see three key factors, I mean, that played really in the surge of populism in Tunisia and in the dismantling of the democratic experiment the country has been witnessing or living or going through since 2011, since the Arab uprisings, of course. I think the first factor is I would call this the revenge of the economy. I mean, meaning basically that since 2011, the economy has been stuck into sort of triangle of doom between with the demands of the population to improve its economic conditions, with the demands and of course, the conditions of the international creditors on the other hand, and of course, with sort of extractive and very opportunistic elites who were balancing between both, I mean, domestic and international constraints in order to keep and preserve their privilege. What Tunisia basically went through is a transition without transformation. It did political transition without transforming its economy. And it ended up, unfortunately, I mean, in a situation where many people who supported actually the democracy at first in 2011 ended up in a way questioning the capacity of democracy to deliver, especially, I mean, among young and employed people in the interior regions, etc. The second key factor is the capacity of Kais Saied to play the insiders-outsiders divide. I think Moses has mentioned this point, and in the case of Tunisia, I mean, Saied was extremely played this card very opportunistically in a way. I mean, in Tunisia, the country is divided into insiders. I mean, with organized labor benefiting, I mean, secure jobs, social protection arrangements, and of course, I mean, included or insider businesses benefiting from, you know, protection, political connections, etc. And a part of the population which is completely outside of these arrangements and of this protection. And I think what has made the success of Tunisia in 2013 with the national dialogue, with the I mean, both business union and labor union mediating a sort of solution in order to preserve the democratic experiment, turned out at the end really to solutions that sideline the outsiders and preserving the advantages of the insiders. So we saw both the organized labor and the businesses playing the role of kingmakers, blocking or vetoing reforms to transform the structure of the economy. This is extremely important because at the end, the deal was perceived as a sort of opportunistic arrangement between elites from which a large part of the population has been sidelined. And I think these outsiders ended up being really captured by Said. The third factor is related to the way Said operated since his election in 2019. Because simply he acted as an institutional veto player. Since his election, he acted to dismantle the democratic institutions. I mean, he blocked the creation of the Constitutional Court. He blocked, government reshuffle. And I think this attitude of Said as an institutional veto player has delegitimized already very weakened institutions. And of course, with a very fragile democracy, this has been really a terrible attitude that ended up, of course, laying the ground to his coup on the 25th of July, 21.
Thank you, Hamza. That's also a sobering picture, and we'll revert back to several of those themes you mentioned, including the insider-outsider dynamics as well as the economic picture. But finally, Oliver, I wanted to turn to you and turn our gaze to Latin America. You're based in Brazil, but there's broader trends here that deserve to be examined. You've written about what you've called a resurgent pink wave across leftist leaders across Latin America. So I wanted to ask you if you can tell us a bit more about what these leaders hope to achieve, and how you think these new governments will shape the political environment of the region.
So there's been, over the past years, we've seen the resurgence of leftist leaders across the region, with very few exceptions now, center-left or left-wing governments dominant in the region. But that's above all an anti-establishment phenomenon. And I would expect in the coming year center-right governments to win, because these center-left governments in power, left-wing governments in power right now, continue to be unpopular. So it's above all a remarkably stable trend of rejection of whoever is in power. Governing is very difficult in Latin America, in part because the opposition is not particularly democratically minded, but sometimes these governments are fragile. So that makes it more difficult to plan ahead. The focus in numerous of these governments is on political survival internally. That also makes regional cooperation more difficult. And I think I see some potential, perhaps in countries like Chile or Colombia, to advance some reforms to change the social contract to a degree that would make it possible to maintain political stability in moments of economic stagnation, which is something that the region hasn't been able to achieve. We've basically had a completely lost decade. Countries like Brazil have essentially grown 0% over the past 10 years. And that explains why, voters are vulnerable to radical solutions, as has been the case when Jair Bolsonaro was elected in 2018. And so I think we will continue to have significant upheaval, huge governability issues, and a lot of challenges to deal with polarization, because it's not, as I said, not only necessary to have a democratically minded government, but you also need an opposition that is willing to play within, play by the rules. And I think we're also seeing, just as a final point, we're seeing an emergence of a threat that we thought no longer existed to Latin American democracy, which is the role of the armed forces, which in countries like Brazil have yet again emerged as a relevant political actor with a somewhat tenuous or ambiguous stance towards democracy. And that makes it increasingly important to focus again on international rules and norms, as has been the case during the recent Brazilian election, when the U.S. government has signaled very clearly to the Brazilian armed forces that it would be opposed to any rupture of democratic rule.
Thanks, Oliver. That's a really notable insight on the role of the armed forces and the role of international partners in pressuring the armed forces or laying out some parameters. So maybe we can return to those themes as well. We'll also return to, you discussed the rise of Bolsonaro, we'll discuss the recent election and the exit of Bolsonaro subsequently. But before we do that, I do want to go back to Moisés now for a second round of engagement. And just a reminder to those watching online or in the audience in Beirut that we will be turning to you for your questions as well in just a little bit. So we welcome those. So Moisés, I wanted to return to you and some of the cases that you've identified or examined. So rising anti-democratic populism in places ranging from Colombia to Italy to elsewhere. What can you tell us a bit more about what these populist leaders have in common from any particularly instructive cases? You mentioned the broad trends in your opening remarks. And also, is there anything particular to know about local or regional dynamics and how that can shape the nature of authoritarianism?
Great questions, Francis, and all very relevant. The context of all this is a global clash between outsiders and insiders. Around the world, we have seen an appetite on the part of voters and the people to support newcomers, new faces. The people want just new people, different from anything we had before. Anyone that had anything to do with power in business, in politics, in the military. We don't want that. We want new faces, even if those new faces, these outsiders, know nothing about governing, know nothing about how to run a country, they are preferred. There's a certain disdain for the expertise of old-timers. And so one of everywhere around the world, you can even see old-timers disguised as newcomers. In Colombia, for example, that was mentioned by Oliver, the president is packaged himself and presented himself as a new face, but in fact he has been in politics for over 30 years. You can also say that about Lula in Brazil. In many ways, Lula presented himself as a newcomer, as somebody that will do things differently, and that is what people come, and that is what people want, rather. And so, but at the same time that we have the clash between the old-timers and the newcomers, the new faces, we also have the permanent presidents that don't want to leave, that immediately, as soon as they get in power, they start undermining the checks and balances, mostly aiming at guaranteeing their permanence in power, doing away with time limits and term limits, and so. Again, the two dynamics are out there, a huge appetite for new faces and outsiders, and the clash between the former presidents that never leave. And that is a trend, a global trend. Once in power, stay in power, except that in the past, they had no problem just defining themselves as dictators and saying, strongmen. Now they all have a strong impulse to package themselves as Democrats. Democracy is a seal of gold housekeeping that they want. They need the legitimacy, even if it's fake, even if it's based in bad elections and tricked and rigged elections. They need to look democratic. That's a new important part. Even though democracy, as we know it and as it should be, is clearly in danger of extinction. Democracy is under attack. Checks and balances are diluted, limited, and weakened around the world. The global context for all that is a volatility, a kind of upheaval that Oliver mentioned that is global. Everyone, we all know that big changes are going afoot, that big things are happening, unprecedented forces, unprecedented consequences, institutions, things and ideas that we thought permanent have proven to be transient, and things that we thought were transient are now permanent. Think about remote work. Remote work was supposed to be very transitional for the pandemic, but now it is here to stay. So to the volatility and the anxiety, there is the surge of inequality in a lot of the developed countries in Europe and surely in the United States. And that inequality, it creates the kind of polarization that Rachel mentioned that is very, very noxious. There is a dynamic around that makes democracy, the functioning of democracy, undermines the functioning of democracy. And again, it is all the fight of to get fake legitimacy in order to govern, because governing has become very hard. It's very hard to have to be successful as a government just by performance. So the legitimacy drawn from good performance is lost. So they have to look for other sources of legitimacy, and that is why the three P's that I mentioned, populism, post-truth, and polarization, try to replace performance as a source of legitimacy.
Thanks, Moisés. And you mentioned presidents who never leave, or former presidents who there's a concern they never leave. And that has certainly been a concern that we've had here in the United States in recent years. We heard analysis about that leading up to the 2020 elections. And then we heard sort of other concerns leading up to the midterm elections that just wrapped up this fall here in the United States. Rachel, I wanted to turn to you to sort of examine what you take away from those recent elections. There has been a bit of a narrative here in Washington after these most recent midterm elections that US democracy has been, quote, saved, that we're out of the woods. So I wanted to ask you, is it that simple? Are you sleeping better at night? And what are the longer term trends that you're watching vis-a-vis the US and our populism and our democracy that you think will be important shaping how US democracy fares? We can also get into either now or subsequently sort of longer term strategies that you think are important to shore up US democracy.
Sure. Well, I wish it were that simple and things were saved. I mean, it was a good election. It was a fair election. It was a pretty well run election with some gaffes. And we are lucky that given that this election was setting the stage for what actors would be in power when the 2024 presidential election came up, we're lucky that the election deniers didn't win in key places in key states. But the majority of election deniers did win. They just won in deep red states where any Republican candidate who won the primary was going to win. And we had very poor quality candidates who almost won. Witness the runoff in Georgia, where a barely literate domestic abuser who doesn't uphold any of the conservative policy platforms came extraordinarily close to winning. So I think, first of all, we have to acknowledge that a lot of what happened was the work of a huge number of organizations, making sure that people knew how poor quality the candidates were. Groups like Republicans for the Rule of Law that were talking about why these Republican candidates weren't necessarily standing for the rule of law and so on. Huge amount of work. And sort of walking away now and declaring victory is a little bit like Ruth Bader Ginsburg's line when the Voting Rights Act was dismantled, saying, you know, it's a little bit like getting rid of your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. This would be the wrong time. We're definitely not out of the woods. If you look at violence statistics, it's skyrocketing still. If you look at the primaries, what we saw was that violence and intimidation really prevented the rise of a more normal pro-democratic Republican faction. So a lot of the violence didn't happen in the general election when people were expecting it. It happened against election officials in places like Arizona. It happened against people like Liz Cheney in Wyoming, who couldn't campaign, basically had no campaign events that were public because of threats and intimidation. It happened prior to the primaries, so that many of the people who voted against impeachment, the Republicans who voted against impeachment, didn't run because they were threatened so much. So what you saw was these threats and intimidation preventing the rise of a pro-democratic Republican faction long before we got to this recent election. What you see in other countries didn't happen in America. Yash Monk's research suggests that most populist authoritarians get a second term. What happened instead is more in keeping with my own research, which suggests that if they don't get a second term, you get a centrist. But the centrist is usually a one-termer because the public is their appetite has been so wedded for celebrity, for scandal, for gossip, that centrist one-termer seems really boring. a lot of problems that have been ginned up by the populist authoritarian come to roost on the centrist one-termer. So if you look at after Berlusconi in Italy or after the Kirchners in Argentina, what you end up with is this sort of sorry figure who's trying to clean out the stables, can't quite do it, and gets sent out. And then you get this polarization banging between the extremes of the parties. So in Italy, the Five Stars and the League governing together, celebrity politics that favors rich people and name recognition. The judiciary tends to be really important for pulling countries back from the brink, but then get to be weakened and politicized in the process. So I think right now it's lucky what happened in this election. It also was the result of a huge amount of work, but we still have a lot of work to do at a very deep level. Social trust in America used to be the highest in the world. Now it's at sub-Saharan African levels or post-Soviet levels. That's really not good. We're seeing this immense amount of change. Moisés mentioned the pandemic, working from home. Well, working class families couldn't work from home. And so what you're seeing is a lot of anger toward elites about that, a lot of sense that we're really not getting the economic anxiety, a lot of feeling that traditional values are still being pulled aside. And so this political realignment that's underway in America, where Republicans are becoming more populist as a party. So it's not just Trump anymore. You're seeing this large wave of Republicans that are against foreign entanglements, including aid to Ukraine. I don't know if it made international news, but Marjorie Taylor Greene had a vote on the Foreign Affairs Committee that got more than 20 fellow Republicans to vote for further scrutiny of Ukraine aid. It didn't pass out of the committee because all the Democrats voted against it. But it's a harbinger of what's to come, bashing China, but not prepping for actual war or defense of allies, bashing corporations publicly, but continuing tax breaks, cultural issues and polarizing issues to pull the working class together. And so you can imagine this realignment of the political parties. You have a Republican populist party led by someone like a DeSantis, willing to use the state in ways that the Republicans have not previously been willing to use the state in a somewhat authoritarian manner. And Democrats become a minority party of college-educated people, high education corporations. That's not a majority in America. And that seems to be where we're headed right now.
Thanks, Rachel. Given what you've described about sort of the post-Trump, at least currently post-Trump moment in American politics and the challenges that face the administration that came after him, President Joe Biden, how boring centrists often have to grapple with the problems that were really seeded in the previous administration or before. I actually wanted to pivot right back to Brazil and bring in Oliver on this, because there was a lot of discussion in the last few years about the parallels between Bolsonaro and President Trump, and then the question of what would come next. We just saw a very monumental election in Brazil, of Lula, and transition is underway now. So Oliver, I wanted to sort of ask you to reflect on the same angles that Rachel did. What does this latest election in Brazil tell you about politics there? Where do you think it's going? And what do you think it says about resilience of democracy in Brazil? And maybe what can we learn for other cases?
So I think Brazilian democracy stepped back from the cliff. This is the first time since democratization that a Brazilian president was not reelected. So this was initially Bolsonaro's election to lose. At the same time, we have this profound regional anti-establishment mood, which I think played a significant role. So I think it was a good election. I think a lot of what Rachel has said applies to Brazil, even though Bolsonaro is not a U.S. import, even though he's called himself the Trump of the tropics, he's a very Brazilian phenomenon. And this is something that Moisés said is, there's every Brazilian family has a family member who's just like Bolsonaro, or a close friend who's just like Bolsonaro. And these family members do not tend to occupy leading positions in society, but are mostly sort of, an uncle who lives in the interior. And so there was this idea that he really was able to embody this wish to put somebody in charge who had never been in charge, even though he had been in politics for such a long time. He's been a congressman for decades. So this really, what Moisés said, applies to Brazil. And I think that perhaps without the pandemic, in a better economic situation, he probably would have won re-election easily. And if cases of Hungary and Venezuela and other countries tell us something, is that these kinds of leaders tend to crack down much more intensely after re-election. So this was close. It was a very close election, the closest we've had in history. But a series of issues I think we can learn of how to beat candidates like that. The first is build a very broad tent. So Lula, who himself is quite controversial and has been accused of having shown some populist instincts himself, has built a very broad tent, picked a conservative as vice president. We've had quite a resilient judiciary and media, and the focus really wasn't on let's save democracy, but it was mostly on sort of competence and the economy. Because I think the Brazilian experience shows it's really not safe to say we have to vote for me because the other guy is just an authoritarian. I think it was really about other issues, and the economy in the end was, I think, decisive. But as I said, outside pressure played a huge role as well. But even though Bolsonaro lost, he still got more than 49% of the vote. Bolsonarismo is here to stay, and I think that will make it very challenging to govern this country, and the risk of political violence remains quite high.
Thanks, Oliver. That's duly noted, both on how Brazil stepped back from the cliff and why the cliff is still a real danger. So nobody should be sleeping better when it comes to Brazil either, I guess I'm taking away from this uplifting conversation. So Oliver, you mentioned the really crucial role of outside actors in helping facilitate this transition. And Hamza, I wanted to turn back to you with a sort of parallel question on the role of outside actors. You have written about the role of economic actors such as the IMF and other international organizations in Tunisia's political picture. What would you tell us about what we should learn about those international actors, including the UN, including the IMF, including the bank? How did their work affect the threat of authoritarianism in Tunisia? And what lessons do you think we should learn from how the economic picture played a role in the power grab that occurred?
Thanks, Francis. Actually, I mean, Tunisia is offering some, an experience which is quite interesting in a sense that it's populism in times of austerity, actually. And this is quite unique in the region, at least, because, I mean, with Said, this is not really a sort of classical authoritarian regime that we used to see either in Tunisia, I mean, in the past, before 2011, or in Egypt today, or in other contexts. So what Tunisia is really going through currently is a sort of concentration of power and the implementation of sort of adjustment to, economic adjustment to, or fiscal adjustment to the imported imbalances that the country, has witnessed over the previous years. Now, Tunisia is negotiating with the IMF. There is a sort of staff level agreement that has been reached quite recently. But of course, what is really missing is a coherent economic vision. Said, his government, especially the government, not really Said, has been presenting the agreement with the IMF as a sort of panacea or a solution to the country, which is not the case. This is a minimalist agreement, and Tunisia needs a plan, an economic plan, a new and a fresh economic vision in order really to recover from the shocks and the previous slow growth, actually, years of slow growth rates. This is hugely needed, and this is lacking, actually. So the big test for Said is, in a way, to and his government, of course, is to operate a sort of economic adjustment and at the same time to offer a sustainable economic solution to the country, to build a sort of vision or plan that offer a medium to longer term vision to Tunisia. I mean, and they are really missing this. They are really failing to offer this. So I think one of the key issues that Tunisia is in need for, and that the international community has to or can help with, is pushing Tunisia's actors, stakeholders, I mean government and opposition, in a way to come up with a recovery plan supported by a political solution. I mean, Said is failing, and I think the IMF and the international financial institutions are, they understand perfectly that Tunisia has economic and serious economic problems, but it has a huge political one. I mean, a huge political challenge and a huge political stalemate that is preventing really any recovery plan from taking place. So this is first. The second thing, I mean, very important that the international community should insist on is to preserve the space of freedom, the civic space, and especially the freedom, I mean, of press, of media, public freedoms that has been gained or secured in Tunisia since 2011. I think this is extremely important simply because there is a huge temptation, again, from Said to use the security sector in order eventually to tame the opposition and to tame protest movements, etc. With the concentration of power, we are seeing an increasing reliance from the regime on the security and the temptation to rebuild the security capacity or the capacity of the security sector in order to make it again the backbone of the regime. I think that the international community has an important role in helping Tunisia's actors from the civil society and the opposition eventually to really preserve the freedom and the political and civic space that has been gained and created and won actually since 2011.
Thank you, Hamza. That's a really notable point on the role of the security sector and sort of the role that international actors need to play, as well as the economic angle. So at this moment, I'd like to re-invite our audience, either watching online or in the live audience in Beirut, to gather your questions. If you're watching online, you can submit them via YouTube, I believe. And if you're watching in Beirut, I'm going to turn to the room in just a moment to ask if there are any questions. But first, I wanted to ask one last question for all four panelists or whomever would like to weigh in. You don't have to. This panel is obviously about what we can learn from different regions on the rise of populism and authoritarianism. The fact of the matter is, authoritarians also learn from one another. They learn from other regions. They learn tools, they learn strategies, they learn communication techniques. So I'd like to hear from any of you what particular examples you've seen of sort of populist learning or authoritarian learning, and what should we take away from those examples? Moisés, go right ahead.
Very quickly, the president of Mexico just issued a statement supporting the vice president of Argentina, Cristina Kirchner, former president. Yesterday, Cristina Kirchner was convicted of acts of corruption. And he immediately, Mr. López Obrador, the president of Mexico, has gone out in support of her. So what we're seeing is a cartel, an international cartel of democratic elected autocrats that work together, that coordinate, that imitate, that follow each other and create in diplomatic circles, in international organizations, in multilateral fora. We can see the coordination, and at least there is that dimension. I'm sure there are many others that my colleagues in the panel can highlight.
Thanks, Moisés. An international cartel. I don't like that image, but I think it's a very strong one. Oliver, and then Rachel.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think that when it comes to communication, there's a lot of that going on. So we've had key advisors of the Trump administration in close contact with the Bolsonaro government. I think a lot of sometimes you literally I see things on far right platforms in the United States, and a week later, the same analogous platforms in Brazil are reproducing this kind of content, even though in many cases it doesn't really make that much sense, because obviously it's always necessary to adapt those to domestic circumstances. So the anti-China rhetoric that Bolsonaro imported from the United States produced a lot of resistance from another ally of Bolsonaro, which is agribusiness, and that was sort of left by the wayside. But I think there's clearly, when it comes to the support networks to produce the narratives, articulate the fake news, all that is clearly part of a global effort as well.
Thanks, Oliver. Rachel.
Just to weigh in quickly, I think we're seeing two different strands kind of coming together. One is that authoritarians are helping one another with more authoritarian strategies. You see Orban in Hungary speaking to conservative activists in America. That's not populism. What it is techniques of electoral control and building an electoral base and so on that are being shared. And then you see populist techniques being shared, for instance, speaking directly to the people without mediation so that no one can ask questions or journalists can't do their homework, and shared between, as Oliver was saying, Trump and Bolsonaro and so on. So we're seeing both in a blending of the authoritarian and the populist techniques. I would say we're also seeing things that look shared, but are actually not. So for instance, Trump in his most recent speeches has been talking about killing drug dealers. And this looks like it's being stolen from the Philippines, from Duterte. But I think it's actually quite domestic. America's had this opioid addiction problem among the white working class, and now the people of color in the working class. It's just decimated huge portions of the country. We've had actually life expectancy decline before COVID. That's unprecedented for a developed nation of a democracy like ours because of this opioid crisis and fentanyl. And so there's a domestic desire to kill drug dealers. And so Trump might be stealing some of the idea from Duterte, but it has a very deep domestic resonance with people here.
That's interesting, Rachel. So I'm hearing, even if there's some inspiration, that it's often more effective to then put actually a domestic spin on the message or the technique. One size doesn't fits all, which Oliver also alluded to. Hamza, there in the room, I don't know if you'd like to weigh in on this question of either populist learning or authoritarian learning. You're on mute.
Yeah.
There you go.
Maybe one of the key trends that we are observing now, I mean, in many countries, which is the alliance between populist and security/military, which is quite interesting. I think very opportunistically, many populist leaders, they are not really interested into building social coalitions to sustain their regimes, or to simply because they are leading or governing under-resourced states, or this is a time of austerity, they do not have resources to share. But so very opportunistically, they are really offering and building a sort of alliances with security and military. This is the case in Mexico. This is the case, has been the case with Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Oliver has been describing this. And this is currently the case with Said. I think this alliance that many populist figures are trying to build is quite interesting, and shows that they are really not interested in building sustainable social coalitions, but are more motivated by very opportunistic motivations to grab power and to preserve, to keep power in a way.
Thank you, Hamza. It's well noted on those alliances with security and military actors. For now, I want to turn to open this up to questions for the audience there in Beirut. I understand there is a robust team of people with microphones there who are ready to bring the microphone to you to ask a question. So I'm just going to pause for one moment to see if there are any coming in there. And for those watching online, I'd like to remind you, you can submit written questions as well, and we will get to those.
Hello, Francis. Rosa Balfour here from Carnegie Europe. Thank you very much. These were really interesting comments. I have a question, and I don't want to go into the issue of definitions, but I would like to ask you, is it populism that is a threat to democracy, or is it authoritarianism? And secondly, following on that, where is the threshold? Where is it that populism actually becomes authoritarianism? Thank you.
Hi, this is Olivia Lazard from Carnegie Europe. I'm still piling up from Carnegie Europe questions. In my research about the geopolitics around critical minerals, particularly in the so-called global south, I'm seeing that there is a trend towards the instrumentalization of corruption and fragility, which is leading towards more authoritarian trends under the guise of democratic regimes. Parts of the strategies and tactics that are used by Russian and Chinese actors in particular is how to create misinformation and disinformation bubbles. In the case of Russia, there is deployment of Wagner, which understands fairly well sort of local and political and sociocultural factors, but there is also sort of an echo chamber that is created on social media and in political discourse. So I guess my first question is, do we understand well how disinformation and misinformation bubbles are being created in contexts where fragility is high and where there is less democratic oversight or institutional oversight, and therefore how to fight it? And the second question, which is interesting because it's sort of, I'm moving now to the sort of global north, is there seems to be a co-optation of environmental activist discourses by Russian and Chinese actors against industrial interests in Europe, in the United States. And this partly contributes essentially to trying to turn democratic vibrancy against geoeconomic interests. Is this something that you're seeing playing out as well in Brazil, or like how is it, like I can observe it better in Europe, how is it playing out in the US as well, or in different contexts that you're looking over? Thank you.
Thank you. If there's one more in the room, we'll take it. If not, we'll go back to the panels.
Hi, this is Raya Jalabi with the Financial Times, not of Carnegie Europe. So I just had a question. If Rachel could actually expand on that point she was making earlier about some certain trends that we're seeing that seem shared, and you mentioned the sort of Trump-Duterte parallel. That seems quite counter to what a lot of people are arguing, which is that you have this sort of shared narrative and shared strategies amongst populist movements in various countries. So I just would love for you to expand a little bit more on your observations.
Okay, terrific. So we are going to take those three questions and let the panelists respond to any that they think they can weigh in on. So to recap, the first from Rosa was to be a little more precise on this definition between populism and authoritarianism. They're not the same thing. Is there a line in which one becomes the other? The second from Olivia Lazard was on sort of how we understand how misinformation and disinformation are exploited, especially in fragile contexts and conflict-affected contexts. She also asked about the trend of turning democratic vibrancy against economic interests. This is a trend she's noted in Europe. Is it playing out in other regions that you each study? And then finally, from the FT journalist, I apologize, I didn't catch your name. Since you're not from Carnegie Europe, I don't know it off the top of my head. but asking to sort of expand upon the trend lines that Rachel in particular drilled down on sort of Trump and Duterte, that it sort of runs against the popularly conceived wisdom. I'd also add that we've got, after the end of this panel, which will go for about 15 more minutes, we do have a fireside chat with the Director General of the Multinational Force and Observers, who's Liz Dibble, and that'll be moderated by the Director of Carnegie Middle East Program, Amr Hamzawi. So stick around for that. But without further ado, I'm going to go to the panelists in this order. Rachel first, then Moisés, then Hamza in the room, and then Oliver. So Rachel, over to you to weigh in on any of those questions you'd like.
Sure. So on the last one, I think there's just a lot of confusion and using words very loosely about who's a populist, who's an authoritarian. Democracy is in retreat for a lot of different reasons. My colleague Tom Carruthers and Ben Press wrote a great paper on this recently that maybe someone could drop in the chat. But there's a populist ability to pit us versus them, go directly to the people, claim that you're a savior, then weaken institutions because they're standing in the way of you doing what you need to do. That's sort of pure populism. America's had it since Andrew Jackson. Trump is a recent incarnation. We had Huey Long as well. There's a domestic tradition of this in America that goes way back. Then you have someone like a Modi. I wouldn't call Modi a populist. He's a more traditional conservative character. He's used some populist tropes, but and same with Orban. There are different reasons for eroding democracy. That doesn't make them better or worse, but one has to sort of look at the specifics of the different cases. And I think a lot of the popular narrative comes from mushing them all together. In America, we have enough of a long-standing trope of populism that pits regular people against a corrupt elite that there hasn't been much need to draw on international examples. We are seeing a little bit of it now. I would say the anti-Semitism is more imported. That's a newer one for America. But it comes from the Great Replacement theory, which is not new to America. That's a white nationalist theory that's had a long-standing base in America and has just been expanded. So, sadly, there's a lot of good reason to believe that these things will continue locally and don't need the extra help. I'd also say to the misinformation and disinformation bubbles, I think Russia and China are certainly doing a lot, especially Russia, on misinformation and disinformation. We see it in America. We see it in the Spanish language parts of America, where Spanish-speaking voters in Florida getting their information from other parts of the world are getting a lot of Russian disinformation. But again, I wouldn't overstate their role. These voters are believing this because of the level of dislike for the other party, because of longstanding fissures that are domestically involved, and because the parties really are quite separate. In America, at least, they really do want very different policy belief sets to be enacted, and people are not necessarily wrong to be scared if they dislike that other set of policy beliefs. You don't need Russia to tell you that if you think you're a woman who needs abortion, it might be problematic to have the other party in power. Russia can deepen that. So I would, there's a lot going on domestically, and thinking it's all international is a misnomer.
Thank you, Rachel. Moisés, to you.
Yeah, I second most of the point, all of the points that Rachel mentioned. Let me just ask, Rosa's good question is, in underlying her question is the notion that populism need not be autocratic, that you can have popular populism that is democratic, and that is essentially promising the people that desperately need help, government policies aimed at them, anti-poverty programs and the sort of things that may be seen as populist, but they may be populist, but they are not autocratic. They're not leading to the collapse of democracy in the places where they're taking place. And then Rosa asks the very good question: how do you know? Well, it is blurred. Is a line that is blurred. At the center of that is the fiddling with the electoral system, the electoral functioning, all of the trappings of democracy and all of the practices of democracy that go around elections and go around the the fact that term limits are under attack. As I said before, there is a strong propensity among many presidents to find ways to stay in power after the term. And so that is that. And the other thing is that one of the tools that these populist autocrats, anti-democratic leaders done is stealth. A lot of what they do is stealthy. It's not visible to the naked eye. You need to be an expert to understand what some obscure change in some obscure law, in fact, is concentrating power, is undermining democracy. And so there's stealth. And, I even thought at some point of talking about a stealthocracy, a group of leaders based on stealth, on acting without the possibility of others to discern what in effect they're doing to undermine democracy. So yes, you can have populism that is not autocratic, but the line is blurred and the line is easy to manipulate by those that want to appear as Democrats, but in fact there are autocrats.
Thank you, Moisés. Just to add to this point on the importance of definitions and the distinctions between definitions, I wanted to add that the U.S. national security strategy, which just came out a couple months ago, the Biden administration has been talking a lot about this sort of contest between democratic systems and authoritarian systems. What was notable to me reading that strategy, which you can find online, is that the strategy says our biggest concern is not with authoritarian systems or autocratic systems per se. It is with those in which authoritarian or autocratic tendencies is layered onto a revisionist impulse. So I think calling out Russia quite specifically on that. So that seemed to be a bit of an acknowledgement that these gradations and the nuances are important to the US administration. So take that for what it's worth, but I wanted to weigh in there. All right, Hamza, I'd like to go to you in the room to ask you to weigh in on any or all of the questions that were posed.
Yeah, very quickly, Francis. Actually, to answer maybe or to complement what has been said by the colleagues on populism, the difference between populism and authoritarianism. I think that populism is a style, is a sort of strategy or tactic to conquer power. Authoritarianism is, the way I understand, it requires a sort of the capacity to build a sort of regime, social alliances. Populism could turn into authoritarianism, but this requires a sort of consolidation. In democratic context, as Moisés mentioned, I think that there is, populists are really, they have this idea or this objective to dismantle checks and balances, dismantle institutions, etc., to end up maybe replacing them by more, autocratic or by autocratic alternatives. But authoritarianism, at least, in the MENA region, what we have been witnessing is there is no authoritarian regime without really sort of social coalition alliances that sustain them. Qais Said today is it embodies or reflects the temptation of a populist figure so far enabled to consolidate his regime or to build a regime or to build at least alliances to try to settle or to consolidate his power. That's why maybe there is this connection, very opportunistic connection, or alliance with the security. So maybe this is the difference I see. Between populism. Of course, populism can turn to be authoritarianism since or as far as it succeeds to settle and consolidate through some alliances. The remark of Olivia on misinformation, disinformation is very important. In the MENA context, which I know the best, I think that the big difference between today and 2011 is that regimes, they have upgraded. Cyberspaces, they have been really, in 2011 spaces, free spaces, allowing protest movement to organize, to mobilize, etc. Today, regimes are present, very active in the cyberspace. And they are one of the key players, actually, dividing movements, playing this divide and divide, not divide and rule, even in the cyberspace, which is really interesting what we are witnessing in Iran, in Egypt, in Tunisia. and in many other contexts, is a sort of really the rise of surveillance state. I mean, state is getting really extremely active in the cyberspace, upgrading its technological capacities, which is quite worrying, unfortunately. I mean, for public freedom actually in this region.
Thank you, Hamza. And Oliver, over to you for any of those questions.
Yeah, I agree with all of what has been said. I just wanted to add one issue about disinformation. I think it's not only populists who can learn from each other, but it's also those combating, misinformation or disinformation distributed by populist authoritarians. So Brazil's electoral court actually studied the post-electoral situation in the United States and adopted a far more rigorous stance when it came to election-related misinformation in Brazil. And the president of the electoral court in Brazil actually signaled to the Bolsonaro government that if the president were to actively challenge the result or share fake news about the election, he could run the risk of losing his political rights. So he would perhaps not be able to run in the future. And a lot of people, including myself, believe that that has played an important role in explaining Bolsonaro's silence. So differently from Trump, who's immediately challenged the result, Bolsonaro has actually been quiet, which is his way of compromising between not wanting to disappoint his radical followers who think the elections were stolen, but also not running afoul of the electoral court.
Thank you, Oliver. With that, I'm going to ask panelists for one final lightning round. And this is really directed at the year ahead. This conference is looking at 2023 reverberating crisis. I wanted to ask you about the action agenda for the year ahead. What can be done to push back on global authoritarianism and bolster democracy? So if you were advising either the US administration or Brazilian administration or whichever actors you like, what are the top 1 or 2 recommendations that you think they should take away, that the audience should take away on how collectively we can push back on authoritarianism? So 1 or 2 top actions or recommendations. I will go to Oliver first, just to mix it up, then Rachel, then Moisés, and then Hamza in the room. Oliver, to you.
So very quickly, I think 2 issues from a Latin American perspective come to mind. The first is international cooperation on seeking to prevent the militarization of government, which really in many countries has been going hand in hand. Not in all of them. There are populist governments which may actually include a threat to democracy, which are not aligned to the military, but many of them are. So I think seeking to establish regional rules and norms that limit the political engagement of armed forces is an important step. And the second issue, I think, is to also cooperate internationally in order to engage social media platforms to establish clear rules on how to combat disinformation. And I think without, as long as we have algorithms that prioritize radicalizing, polarizing information, which make it very difficult in social networks to gain visibility with moderate, depolarizing content, I think fighting populism will be very difficult.
Thank you, Oliver. Very concrete actions. I like it. Rachel, to you.
Sure, I'll just have one, which is that I think despite the gloom and doom of the panel and it sounds like the conference, we really need to start building a positive democratic story. Optimism used to be on democracy's side. It was on democracy's side in 1942 when we got down to 12 democracies in the world. It was on democracy's side in 1992 when we started to build the third wave. It is not on democracy's side right now. So we spend a lot of time with gloom and doom against what the authoritarians are doing. But all we can offer in return is, oh, let's build back the democracies we had 30 years ago, which is not a democracy that is very exciting to Gen Z. It's not a democracy that we know worked against oligarchy and economic forces in the former Soviet Union and much of Latin America, where the democracy simply empowered different oligarchic forces. And so I think what we really need to do is start thinking, what is the democracy that's going to excite people so that they turn away from populism, they turn away from electing in authoritarians on purpose, and they start getting excited about a movement toward a future that they are helping to contribute to.
Thanks, Rachel. Get optimism back on democracy's side. That's very insightful. Moisés, to you, your action agenda.
I would like to read something from the World Bank that says the world's poorest countries face 3 years of soaring debt services costs, draining vital resources from spending on health, education, and social assistance, and leaving dozens of countries with unsustainable debts. The World Bank believes that we are entering a stage of low growth, high inflation, and a debt crisis again. So it will be it's always bad when the politics is debated, discussed, and prescribed without attention to the economics underlying the world. In the same way, it's a very big mistake to talk about politics or talk about economics without taking into account the social consequences and the political consequences of the economic decisions. So we are entering a high inflation period that is completely new to our whole generations. There have been about 2 generations of people in the world to whom inflation was not an issue. Inflation had disappeared as a challenge, as a threat, as a very, very negative force, especially in terms of what it does to the politics of the countries. Now, for the first time, this generation will live in inflation, and we have, Latin America is the world champion in managing these kinds of hyperinflation crisis. I don't know, that there will be a hyperinflation. I know there will be inflation for which nations are not, most of the nations are not ready. And so the main alert, the main warning is pay attention to levels of indebtedness, to levels of payments to serve the debts, and the consequences that will have in social spending that will make politics even more nasty.
Thank you, Moisés. Pay attention to indebtedness. Duly noted. And Hamza, over to you for your last word or last recommendation. You're on mute.
Yeah, I would like to echo the point that Rachel mentioned. I mean, the need to renew democracy in a way and to really give people, hope in democracy again. And I think one of the things that we are witnessing is a sort of fragmentation of elites and fragmentations of protest movements, fragmentation that make things easier for the populists, and even fragmentation and divides on the ways to confront and to oppose populism, actually. So the need to really build and rebuild the sort of strong compromises and consensus between elites, on democratic basis, is something really extremely needed and extremely important. On the agenda of the renewal of democracy and social justice, because what was mentioned by Moisés is extremely important, actually. This is a time of austerity and inflation, and social issues need to be taken into high consideration. And the other factor or the other element to put in the agenda is, the issue of post-truth, misinformation, disinformation. There is a need for sure, to regulate the cyberspace in a way that preserves freedom, but also that confronts this, the whole manipulation that exists on the cyberspace.
Thank you, Hamza, and thank you all four panelists. This was obviously a sobering panel. For me, it was a really informative one. But despite the sobering nature, I also took out some pockets of perhaps hope. And I'd like to underline the points that were just made in that final round about the need for an optimistic narrative, an optimistic agenda, an affirmative agenda. I think, as I think back to Carnegie Middle East panels of past years, it seems like their titles are always things about crises, multiple crises, disruption, fragmentation. So perhaps that's something for the conference planners. Maybe the 2024 conference can be about affirmative agendas for the Middle East and the world. So food for thought. Thank you all. You've been a terrific audience, a terrific panel. And for those tuning in or in the room, just a reminder that at 1:30, in about 14 minutes, we will all reconvene for a fireside chat with Liz Dibble of the Multinational Force and Observers. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.